All right, so now we're recording. Amazing. So Margaret Hamilton, 20th century America. So a roller coaster of cultural and economic phases is beginning in the 20th century. So the 1900s is going to start with a boom in jobs and prosperity. So you're coming out of the second industrial revolution that begins to take hold in the 1890s, bleeds over into the beginning of the turn of the century, into the 1900s, and leads us straight through World War I into the Roaring 20s, which is probably one of the greatest moments of American prosperity that the United States had ever seen. So this is the in-between period, you know, right after we've come out of a war, where everyone's doing really well. Everyone is making a lot of money for the most part. Many people are anyway. However, this kind of all comes crashing down when the stock market crashes in 1929. And the United States doesn't fully recover economically until it enters World War II in 1941. And war production of weaponry and things like that boosts the economy and makes more jobs. And this follows the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, which is the first foreign attack on American soil for a very long time. And this is a kind of friendly reminder to us, American soil is now Hawaii, because we learned about last week how Hawaii became part of America. So a little connection here. So it's into this country who's recovering from economic downfall, who's kind of poised for entrance into probably one of the biggest wars in history, that Margaret Hamilton is born at this point in time in history. Let's talk about who she was. So she's born in 1936. The Great Depression is it's past its worst at this point, and she's born in Indiana, and this is the youngest picture of her I could find. She was the oldest of 3 siblings. She had a younger brother and sister. And while she was born in Indiana, her family later moves to Michigan, and she attends high school in Michigan, and after graduating, she enrolls in the University of Michigan as well, and starts to study math, because she had always loved mathematics. But eventually she transfers to a college in Indiana, to Earlham College, and it's at Earlham that she finishes her degree. So in 1958, she graduates with a degree in mathematics, and she gets a minor in philosophy. So I have the backwards of her degree. I have a degree in philosophy and a minor in mathematics. So she has the opposite of that, which is kind of fun. So she ends up graduating from school in Indiana with those degrees. And this is a picture of what her university looked like, Earlham College. And so what was it like growing up as Margaret Hamilton? Like I said before, she had always had a passion for mathematics. And while she was at Earlham College, she got to know a professor whose name was Florence Long. And Florence Long was a woman professor. She was professor of mathematics. And having a female role model and mentor really helped inspire Margaret to later in her life continue to pursue her dreams to both learn and teach abstract mathematics. So it was because she was able to see a female role model doing what she wanted to do. She was like, you know, if Professor Long can do it, I can do it. And this just speaks to the importance of teachers and professors, especially in university, and having that kind of representation of seeing people like you doing the things that you want to do, because it kind of gives you that little boost of confidence. And it definitely gave Margaret that little boost that she needed to kind of power through and keep doing what she wanted, even though it was rare for women to study math like she did in the 1960s. So another one of Margaret's inspirations was her father, who was a philosopher, and her grandfather, who was a teacher. And it was actually because of them that she made the decision to add philosophy as a minor, even though she was mostly interested in science and math. So it was also while at Earlham College that she met her first husband, James Hamilton. So this is why she goes by Hamilton instead of her original first name, which is, I believe, Heathfield, Yeah, Margaret Heathfield. But she goes by Hamilton now. She kept it when she changed her name. They were married when they were young. She was married the summer after she graduated university, so the summer of 1958. And James hadn't quite finished his degree. He was a little younger than her. So while he was finishing his undergrad degree, she taught French and mathematics at a high school, so kind of following in the footsteps of her grandfather. So that's kind of what her early life was like. And then everything kind of starts to change in a big way. So after James graduated, after her husband graduates, the couple ends up moving to Boston, Massachusetts, where they both are interested in pursuing graduate research. So James begins a master's program in chemistry at Brandeis University, and while he's there, their daughter Lauren is born in 1959. So they've been married about a year at this point. So Margaret had also planned to pursue a master's degree at Brandeis. She wanted to go ahead and pursue abstract mathematics, but she decided, or maybe they collectively decided, that both of them pursuing degrees at the same time would be expensive and difficult, especially with a daughter. So she decides to wait. So she ends up taking a job while her husband completes his education, and they kind of have a deal. He'll finish his education first, and then it'll be her turn to go back and get her degrees. So he continues to finish his master's, and he also goes to Harvard Law School to get a law degree. And she accepts a job in meteorology at MIT in 1960. So I'm sure we've heard of meteorology before. This is the study of predicting weather. And we're really used to watching the news on the TV or on the internet and seeing our weathermen up on the screen, pointing at computers and lots of buttons and lots of graphs and lots of diagrams. But of course, meteorology wasn't always like that. So the study of predicting weather didn't always use computers, and it was just starting to use computers for the first time in the 1960s. And so Margaret Hamilton was one of the first people to kind of pioneer using software and computer programming to predict the weather. And this is a time when the term software engineering actually didn't even exist. There was no such thing as a software engineer in 1960 America. So Margaret had to teach herself to use the computers to make these predictions. So she's quite literally writing these kinds of codes from scratch. So the work that she did while with the meteorology department contributed to both meteorology and mathematics. She worked with, computer programs, but also and prediction patterns, but also with weather. And a lot of her work actually ends up contributing to her supervisor's later publications in something called chaos theory, which is super complex, but just know that it has something to do with abstract mathematics. So her work contributed to that. And she was only a few years out of university. She doesn't stay in meteorology long though. She actually does several projects at MIT, Massachusetts Institute for Technology. So in 1961, she moves to a new project, and this project is called SAGE, or Semi-Automatic Ground Environment. So SAGE is actually the very first U.S. air defense system. And Margaret was one of the first programmers to write code for a prototype that could sense unfriendly aircrafts in U.S. airspace. So now we watch lots of spy movies and detective movies and any kind of movie like that about international espionage or something like that. And we always see them with these big radar screens, right, where they can tell where the different planes or missiles are, and they know exactly where they are to the exact point. It's because of Margaret Hamilton that we even have systems like that, because she was one of the first people to start writing computer code that would help create programs that could track planes like that or missiles through airspaces. So in the 1960s, this is even more important because in America, the Cold War was happening. Has anyone here heard of the Cold War before? See some nods, see some not sures. We're going to talk a little bit about what exactly the Cold War was in a second, just for review. And so the Cold War was raging, and a system could detect the presence of Soviet missiles or other foreign aircraft was a big priority for the American government. So her working on this program was really important. And later, when it became time for her to take a job working for NASA and the Apollo missions, it's going to be the work that she did here on these systems that kind of makes them say, okay, she's the one we want to work on our spacecrafts. But before we keep talking about her, let's do a quick little history sidetrack to review what exactly the Cold War was, because this is kind of important to what she ends up doing later in her life. So after World War II ended, so the war between the Nazis and the Allies, it ended around 1945. After a couple years, new borders are being drawn in all the European countries that had been, overthrown by Nazis. The lands were given back. Some lands were given to the Allies who had defended them, and all that was being settled. And what's interesting is that the Soviet Union, which is now just Russia and a bunch of other countries, but the Soviet Union at the time was communist. But communists were also against Nazis. So the communists had actually sided with the Americans, and we had all been on the same side fighting against Hitler. But now that the war was over, the divide between capitalism and communism was starting to become more and more apparent. There were starting to be some tensions, and the Soviet Union didn't feel that they were being treated as they should be in all the peace talks and the negotiations and the dividing up of the lands. They also knew the United States didn't approve of the way they ran their government, and they didn't want to have their government like that. And these tensions slowly start escalating until it creates a period of time that lasts for about 45 years, from about 47 to 91. And this period becomes known as the Cold War. It's not a war in any sense that we know of. There are no battles fought, there are no missions, there's no good side, bad side. It was called the Cold War because nothing happened. There was like this cold air of tension between two countries that were kind of just waiting for one to attack the other. Especially because we know that World War II ended with the dropping of the first atomic bomb used in battle. So nuclear weapons were kind of on everybody's mind. And so they were worried that if one day the Soviet Union or the United States decided to attack the other, they were going to do it through missiles, nuclear missiles, most likely. And this is why the program Margaret Hamilton worked on was so important, because everybody was worried that one country or the other was going to launch a missile at the other, and they wanted to know where it was and how to figure out what to do about it. So here is kind of a map of what the Soviet Union looked like at the time for a little visual. All these are the countries they are now, but at the time, the Soviet Union included all of this. So was that in the United States, and they were kind of not too happy with each other. But the reason why I wanted to talk a little bit about the Cold War is because the Cold War kind of paves the way for another event in history, the race to outer space, the space race, which I think we've probably all heard of the space race before, right? I'm seeing some people nodding. Amazing. So following World War II, as we already talked about, there was a race between the United States and the Soviet Union as to who would be able to perfect the ballistic missile first. So who would be able to perfectly make a missile that could fly and cause mass destruction on another country. Not the best goal to have, but it's the goal that was going on after World War II because people were very nervous. And it's out of this race to develop the best flying airborne missile that the space race grew, because what better way to either defend or attack airspaces than to do it from beyond the sky and in outer space, like trying to take it up the next level, right? So getting the first man to the moon became not only a matter of, demonstrating the United States or the Soviet Union's technological superiority, like, I'm the best, we got our man to the moon first. It actually starts becoming a little bit of a matter of national defense. So these two things, technological superiority, national defense, are kind of interlocked at this point in history. As people race to get satellites into space, they race to get satellites to the moon, they race to get man to the moon. And this goes on for years and years throughout the rest of the 40s, the 50s, into the 60s. The Russians or the Soviet Union and the United States are racing against each other, and they keep passing. One gets a satellite in, the other one gets a satellite in. One sends a dog into the moon, to space. One sends a chimpanzee into space, and it just keeps going as they start, kind of battling it out. But it's in 1961 when the current president of the United States, at the time this was John F. Kennedy, promised that Americans would land on the moon before the next decade. And he makes this promise when we kind of barely got our satellites off the ground, and people are just like, you are crazy. There's no way we're going to get to the moon in 9 years. You're insane. But actually, Margaret Hamilton is going to help him keep his promise, and even though she or he doesn't know it yet. And here are just some fun pictures from the space race. So we've got Laika, our space dog. We've got some moon landing pictures. We've got Yuri Gagarin, who was the first Soviet in space, first man in space, in orbit. And then we've got the first satellite, which was sent up by the Soviets, Sputnik, the first down here. So Laika, Sputnik, moon landing, and Yuri Gagarin up here. All right, so now that we've got our little history backstory kind of taken care of, Soviet Union, United States aren't happy. They're trying to shoot people up into space so that way, just in case missiles attack, they're ready. If it doesn't sound particularly sensible, it's because it wasn't. The Cold War was greatly a time of stuff kind of being a mess and not making a whole lot of sense. But now we're going to go back to Margaret. So Margaret, MIT, NASA, and Apollo. So after spending some time working for SAGE, remember that was the first U.S. defense aeronautics mission, so her working with tracking enemy air devices, Margaret moves to a new program at MIT laboratories. Remember, she was first working with meteorology, then she moved to like the defense, air defense, and now she's moved to the instrumentation laboratory. So here, researchers and programmers were working to provide aeronautical technology for NASA. And this means stuff to use for their space missions. And in particular, Margaret and her team were given the task of creating a specific kind of software that had never been written before. Remember, she has no prototype for any of this. They've just been given, write this kind of software and you figure out how to do it. For the lunar module, so the pieces that were going to the moon, their guidance and control system. So what would help them get to the moon? What would help them with the tasks they needed to do while they were there for liftoff, takeoff, landings, anything that could go wrong. She had to design all this. She has no templates. No one's ever done this before. So she just has to, her and her team, figure out how to write this all from scratch. And she becomes kind of the head engineer on this project. And this is also when we know that software engineering isn't a thing that we know of today. Like I mentioned it before, they didn't have that. And not only did they not have the term, they didn't have classes in software engineer. There was no way to teach you how to engineer something. So like today, if you're going to write a book, you could probably take a class on how to write, do creative writing, and then you'll go off and write your own original book. Now you take classes on how to software engineer, and then you go off and you can create your own programs. Margaret needed to go off and create her own programs, but she didn't have any classes to take to do it. So they were teaching themselves as they went along, which was really interesting. And they worked out their own issues as they went through it. So here's her work card from when she was a staff there. You can kind of see the word Apollo kind of crossed off at the top. Once again, those big 70s style glasses, which are coming back in style now, which I love. So Margaret in software engineering, let's talk about this term. So she was technically the first person to create the name software engineering. So she coined that term. There are probably a few other engineers, contemporary ones, that were also using it, but she's one of the ones who's credited the most with creating this discipline. So she not only coined it, she truly founded it. And I mean, this is a discipline that has millions of graduates every single year now that didn't even exist. Let's see now, 40, 50, like 60 years ago, we didn't have it. And now we have millions of people who become software engineers every year. There were no schools teaching it. And so it was up to her and her team to not just create the new code, like I said, but also figure out what kind of issues and mistakes could happen with their new code. So they also had to troubleshoot their own programs. They couldn't just afford to experiment with them because that's not how that worked. If you experiment with an astronaut, then someone could die, and that's a problem. So they had to be very careful with that. So Margaret was actually in particular very concerned with those things that could go wrong. Amelia, do you have a question?
No, I just pressed the wrong button.
Oh, no worries. Okay, so she was really concerned with anything that could go wrong with the softwares in the system. So any kind of error or anything that could be detected. So she was interested in writing software that could detect these errors either before or while they were happening, and not only just detect them, but fix them and send alerts to other engineers who needed to be on hand to fix them. And her interest in this kind of like troubleshooting and error locating software becomes really vital for the future Apollo missions. And I bet we're going to talk about two incidents that happened where her expertise there was absolutely vital and probably saved lives. And she was eventually made the lead Apollo flight software designer. So she's the one in charge of designing all the software for Apollo. But here's a quote from her from a fairly recent interview where she talks about what it meant for her to coin this term software engineering. So she says, I fought to bring the software legitimacy so that it and those building it would be given its due respect. And thus I began to use the term software engineering to distinguish it from hardware and other kinds of engineering. Yet treat each type of engineering as a part of the overall systems engineering process. When I first started using this phrase, it was considered to be quite amusing. It was an ongoing joke for a long time. They liked to kid me about my radical ideas, but software eventually and necessarily gained the same respect as any other discipline. So at the time, people thought it was silly to call just the people who wrote the software engineers, because they didn't think that was really anything to be engineering. And this wasn't just because she was a woman. There were men working with her as well. People just didn't think software engineering was a valid discipline. But of course, now we all think very differently. So one small step for a woman as well as a man. So we're talking about the moon landing now. So in 1969, a year before the change of the decade, so right on time with Kennedy's promise, Apollo 11 began its journey to the moon, and it carried on 3 American astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, names that we all probably recognize, and we should recognize them because they were amazing people in history. But we should also remember the name of the 32-year-old woman who was back on Earth in mission control and who had really made the whole thing possible. So this picture here, this is a picture that actually started circulating the internet a lot recently. This is her standing with a pile of the code that she and her team had written by hand because we were not able to write that. There's no machine to write it. So this is code that was written by hand, holes punched by hand, so that way they could insert it into computers. Remember, this is all done manually. And her team wrote this by hand, and she supervised the entire thing. And this is what was needed to get Apollo 11 to the moon. So this is taller than she is, as we can tell from this picture, which is really incredible that she and her team accomplished this. And here's a picture of her kind of working in kind of like, I think, a simulation capsule to kind of figure out some engineering stuff. This is when she was already the lead software designer, so she's like testing out some systems in this picture. So we're going to talk a little bit about something that happened on Apollo 11. So this is the moon landing mission. So we talked before about how she was really interested in tracking software errors and any mistakes that could happen during a mission. So that the value of her expertise and careful attention to those details becomes really, really important and really apparent not long into the Apollo 11 mission. So they were 3 minutes away from landing on the moon. Everything's been going great. 3 minutes left on the clock before they were made to net the official landing. And then out of nowhere, alarms start going off everywhere. And of course, Margaret Hamilton and her team, they're all at mission control, watching everything happening, monitoring it. And so they find out that the astronauts had accidentally left a radar switch on, and this radar switch triggered the alarms. So the first thing is that it's not an emergency. No one's going to die immediately anyway. Everything's okay so far. But the problem is that the computer is sending a signal to the astronauts that's being asked to do too many commands. Because by leaving that switch on, it added more to the computer kind of queue of operations. And now the computer's freaking out, like, I'm not supposed to have these other operations on the list right now. I'm supposed to be focusing on the moon landing. But because Margaret had thought of this before and had kind of created a fallback system, she had designed the computer to have a priority system that would prioritize the most important task over the least important. So once the engineers confirmed this switch isn't a big issue, they were able to tell the computer, go on with the high priority task. And the computer went on and performed the moon landing on schedule. If it hadn't been for her fallback system, the landing would have been delayed, and any kind of delay at that point could have resulted in them not landing at all. So the Apollo 11 could have almost not happened if it hadn't been for her and the way she programmed the system. So her colleagues actually said that the work that she did on error and recovery laid the foundation for the ultra-reliable software design that we have today and continue to make. So she's kind of the one that set those foundations in motion when she was programming for Apollo 11. And then we have the Apollo 8 incident. So this is a little bit earlier. It was a normal day in the MIT instrumentation lab. And Margaret was working, and her 4-year-old daughter, Lauren, at the time was playing beside her because she often brought her with her to work. But Lauren, while she was playing astronaut, accidentally pushed a button that crashed the entire computer system. Thankfully, it wasn't a big deal. Margaret was just working. But when she was thinking, you know, an astronaut could make this mistake as well. You could bump into a button and press it. I mean, it's zero gravity up there, right? And she thinks to herself, you know, a good idea would be if we had a protocol for these kinds of mistakes. Let's fix it so that way if an astronaut presses a button, there's some kind of an undo button to fix it, or, you know, not a real undo button, but she had in her head something that could prevent the whole system from going haywire over one button. But NASA and MIT are just like, actually, let's not do that, because, you know, astronauts, they're trained not to make mistakes. We don't need a fallback system for if they make mistakes. Well, that's what they thought. But during Apollo 8, an astronaut actually makes the exact same error as her daughter did. He presses the wrong button and the whole system goes kapow. And it looks like it's going to be serious. And then because Margaret has seen this before and knows how to fix it, she and her team were actually able to quickly correct for it back at mission control, and everything's fine. And then everyone you can kind of imagine the room, and everyone kind of just like, oh, we probably should have listened to you before. Because after that, every system had these precautions and these kind of undo buttons, or at least something that could deal with it if you pressed the button accidentally, which was really important. So this is a picture here of the engineers in the room in Mission Control during Apollo 8. So we can see Margaret over here. There's another engineer, her name is Phyllis here, a couple others, some in the back. You can see the board back here has a lot of the commands for the system written on it by hand. Everything's done by hand on chalkboards, and all these papers here that they're working on as Apollo 8 is in the air. Because whenever these missions would be up in the air, they always have several engineers on hand. This is still true today. In case anything goes wrong, they're already there to take over and make sure everything's okay. So has anybody here ever watched the clip of the moon landing? I see some nods. I see some no nods. Okay, so we'll do that. Because remember, she's in mission control when this is happening.
This is Houston. Well, clear. Break, break. Buzz, this is Houston. Radio check and verify TV circuit breaker in.
So this is mission control here.
TV circuit breaker in. And base 5 clear. Roger. And we're getting a picture on the TV.
Before we continue, I want to say, did you see the little CBS News thing on the bottom? This was the original broadcast that people got on their TVs at home. So this is the first time anyone saw what the surface of the moon looked like altogether.
There's a great deal of contrast in it, and currently it's upside down on our monitor, but we can make out a fair amount of detail.
These are the astronauts talking back to mission control.
Okay, we can verify the position, the opening I ought to have on the camera. Stand by. There's a foot coming down. There he is. There's a foot coming down the steps.
Live from the surface of the moon. I love that little tag on the bottom.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. Okay, Neil, we can see you coming. Okay, I just checked. Get back up to that first step. That isn't collapsed too far, but it's adequate to get back up. Roger, we copy. Pretty good total jump. So there's a foot on the moon, stepping down on the moon. If he's testing that first step, he must be stepping down on the moon at this point. Buzz, this is Houston. F2, I'm at 1/160th second for shadow photography on the sequence camera. Okay.
In a few seconds, he's going to say things.
The lamp footpads are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Down there is very fine. Boy, look at those pictures. Wow. It's a little shadowy, but he said he expected that in the shadow of the lunar module. Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon on this July 20th, 1969. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
So that's the moon landing. Plugging my headphones back in. Because everyone's watching that on their TV. It's kind of just like holding your breath, waiting for it to happen. And what people didn't know was that just a few minutes before, it almost looked like the whole thing wasn't going to happen. But because of Margaret and her team, it did happen, and we got Armstrong on the moon in July of 1969. So let's talk a little bit before we go on to what she did afterwards about who Margaret was beyond her computer screens. Because the great thing about Margaret is that she was born more recently. And we know more about her personal life than we've known about some of the other people that we've talked about. So she achieved much in software engineering, as we already know. I mean, we just saw the moon landing. She just made happen, helped to make happen, despite the fact that she was in a profession that was mostly dominated by men. And so some of the things she's talked about in her lifetime is that what that was like working in a field that was mostly male dominated, and how she felt a lot that she was the only girl in the boys' club, and how she was often judged, not necessarily by her coworkers, but by other people because she went back to work after having her daughter Lauren, and she also went back to a job that wasn't seen as particularly feminine or appropriate, or at least not normal. But she loved her job, she loved math, she loved computers, and she was so excited about the space program when she got the opportunity. I mean, she was so excited that she gave up the chance to go back to grad school because she just really wanted to work with Apollo and on the space missions. And she didn't want to give up the relationships she had with her colleagues because she said they were the only people who understood how much of a computer geek she was, and who were able to make jokes with her about computers that nobody else could make. And they also shared her interests and her aspirations and her goals for the space program and everything else that had to do with that. So she actually and her first husband, James, divorced in 1967. So just a couple years before Apollo 11 and that whole mission happens. But when their daughter Lauren was young, like I said before, in that incident with Apollo 8, Margaret actually was used to bringing her into the computer labs with her, and Lauren would sleep or she'd play, occasionally crash the system by pressing the wrong buttons. But her mother would be there writing code that would help bring Americans to the moon while Lauren was just kind of sleeping there off to the side or causing chaos, whatever it happened to be. And there were people who judged her for doing that and said, like, how could you just bring your daughter with you to work like this? Why aren't you home with her? And Margaret said there was no reason for that. She wanted to be able to do both, be both a mother and be working on the space program and be a software engineer. And a lot of people say now, I think there's one article that I read that says it best, that people at that time would never imagine that one of the fathers of software engineering would actually be a mother, which I think is a great quote, because she founds it all, and she does it with her daughter there with her. And so this is a picture of her and her daughter Lauren when she was younger. Looks a lot like her. Once again, I said very 70s, long hair, big glasses. You gotta love that. So what happens to Margaret after Apollo? So she stays with MIT and NASA until 1972. And during that time, she assisted on whatever Apollo missions happened during that time. So we already know Apollo 8 and Apollo 11. But she also works on Skylab, which is the first US space station. So she not only helps us get to the moon and get into space, she also starts helping us pioneer this kind of living in space technology where we can send astronauts to space stations and have them stay there and conduct research. So she leaves MIT and the Apollo missions in 1972, and she goes into work with the private sector and starts founding her own companies. So she's still working on software engineering, just doing it privately, and she founds her own company that same year called Higher Order Softwares. And after 14 years, that's doing well, and she founds her second company called Hamilton Technologies in 1986. And throughout her lifetime, she's been the recipient of many awards, including the NASA's Exceptional Space Act Award in 2003, and also the Presidential Medal of Freedom presented to her by President Barack Obama in 2016. Because yes, Margaret Hamilton is still alive. She's 83 years old. She is still alive, still making speeches, still giving interviews. And we're going to see a quick clip here of her receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom just 4 years ago. So let's turn some volume up here.
Margaret Hayfield Hamilton. A pioneer in technology, Margaret Hamilton defined new forms of software engineering and helped launch an industry that would forever change human history. Her software architecture led to giant leaps for humankind, writing the code that helped America set foot on the moon. She broke barriers in founding her own software businesses, revolutionizing an industry and inspiring countless women to participate in STEM fields. Her love of exploration and innovation are the source code of the American spirit, and her genius has inspired generations to reach for the stars.
She's so little. Amazing. So we see her there with a lot of awards were given that day, including to Ellen DeGeneres. Bill Gates was there. So it was a big day. And if you want to see the full speech that former President Obama gives, there is this full video clip is available online if you search Margaret Hamilton Presidential Medal of Freedom. There's also the full ceremony as well of all the other medals they gave that day, if anyone is interested in seeing more of that. So let's talk a little bit about her legacy, even though she's still alive and still, making history every day. But we talk a little bit about the legacy she's left for us in the time she's lived. So obviously she's best known for her contributions to the Apollo space program. When her name started recirculating again more recently and people started talking about her more and how she should be talked about more, it was mostly in connection with Apollo and that big stack of code that she's pictured next to. But it's also important, like the speech that was just given in that award ceremony, to remember her wider contributions. So I mean, first and foremost, because of her software engineering, it's a career that we have, it's a field, it's a discipline, and both men and women alike pursue it every day. You can major in it in college, you can find jobs, and actually people are saying it's one of the most lucrative and most productive fields that you can go into now, because everything is based on computers. And I think it's almost ironic that she got into this career while she was trying to support her husband's career. If it hadn't been for that, she would have been doing her own master's work in abstract math. She might never have even considered going to work for MIT. If she hadn't gone to work for MIT, none of this would have happened. So she lived in a time when women weren't expected to be looking for careers for themselves, especially not careers in engineering. And kind of accidentally, she kind of stumbles upon this, not entirely accidentally, but a little bit. And she ends up kind of founding a whole discipline in the process. So she not only pioneers the way for astronauts and software engineers, but just for all women who are interested in STEM subjects and who maybe are told not quite what you could be doing, but she kind of just goes and she did it anyway, and she did it to the best of her ability. And one quote that I really like from her, because there's so many quotes, so she's given lots of interviews, but she says in one of them that there was no choice but to be pioneers. And I think this can apply to a lot of the things she pioneered. She pioneers a discipline, she pioneers a whole new career for herself, but she also pioneered all these things for women of the time, which I think is really important. And usually I close it off with a picture. Instead, we're going to close it off with a quick 5-minute interview that she gave just 3 years ago, where she talks about her time in Apollo and about founding the title software engineer and about women in STEM today. So we're going to watch this 5 minutes long to close us off today.
I worked for Travelers Insurance as a student actuary. One day, word was going around travelers that there were these new things out there called computers that were going to take away all of their jobs. All the people in the marchand machines, pretty soon they wouldn't have jobs. And so everybody was talking about it. They were scared they wouldn't have a way to make a living. But of course, it ended up being more jobs were created with the computers than there were with the marchand machines. I worked for Professor Edward N. Lorenz. He had an LGP30 in his office, and he taught me everything he knew about the LGP30. Well, he'd hand me something saying, here's the instructions. That's what people used to do, right? So I saw they were advertising for programmers, and this was a new thing. I was hired to work on the ANFSQ7. The XD1 was the first ANFSQ7, and it was at Lincoln Labs. I found out about the Apollo program, so I thought, I guess I should delay graduate school again, because I'd like to work on this program that puts all these men on the moon. There was this one thing that they were worried about, what if the mission aborts? And everybody said it's never going to. It just won't happen. Oh, well, good. We'll give this one to Margaret because she's a beginner and is never going to go there anyway. And sure enough, it aborted. So it went to this program I had written, which I named Forget It. And all of a sudden, I became an overnight expert. So I concentrated on the systems software and then gradually took on in addition to the system software, the command module software, and around the Apollo 8 time, taking over all of the onboard flight software. The one thing that stood out in my mind, being in the onboard flight software, was that it was man-rated, meaning if it didn't work, a person's life was at stake, if not over. That was always uppermost in my mind, and probably many others as well. But be man-rated, and it had to work the first time. You had to simulate the hardware. You had to simulate, the vehicle and the world outside of it. So you had to hope that you simulated everything so it was as much like the real thing as you could get it to be. I started worrying about the astronauts. It worried me, what if there's an emergency and they didn't know it? So I had a meeting with software and hardware people. So what I wanted to do was to interrupt the astronauts to tell them there's an emergency so they'd stop doing what they're doing. So they said it can't be done. I said, why not? So I came back with a solution the next day. They thought about it and they said, I think it can be done. The hardware guys got behind it. They put the stuff into the hardware. And then the Houston guys put it into their checklist for the astronauts. They practiced. So it's in there for both the LEM and the command module in case there's an emergency, whatever it might be. Now we go to Apollo 11 and it's time to land. And all of a sudden, guess what comes up? Priority displays telling them there's an emergency. This is just before they land. And here were the things that I had wanted to do, was to warn the astronaut when there's an emergency. There were too many things going on in the computer, and the astronaut knew that he had put the switch in a position that had caused extra stuff affecting the computer. And he realized, oh yeah, and he put it back in the right place, and they landed. After the manned missions, I guess I personally just had a sense of history about wanting to not just remember things, but do something based on what lessons were learned. Just like when an error would happen, you'd find a way not to let it happen again. I got funding for this error study, we called it. We took those errors and came up with this theory of control. And there were 6 axioms having to do at the time with software. In fact, the more you make use of this development before the fact mechanism, that you adhere to it or make use of it, the more reliable it's going to be. I gave a talk at my college at Earlham where they want to know what is it like being in the engineering field and being a woman. That it almost seemed to be worse in some ways today than it was back in the early days. When you see women not being allowed to drive in certain countries, or you see women can't become priests, and you start seeing it, and you know how I feel about system of systems of systems and the butterfly effect or whatever. Every single one of those things impacts our culture or impacts women or minorities as to whether they can even do something or not. Because kids might think, well, I can't do that because I'm this or I'm that. Until we start making changes, until our leaders stop admiring people who do things that encourage that, we have a problem, right?
Okay, so that's Margaret Hamilton, just a couple years ago. She's still alive. Like I said, she's 83. Very well versed, very smart. And I mean, just some of the examples you see of some of the stuff she's written and created and how easily she talks about it. Like it's nothing that she just single-handedly saved the Apollo 11 moon landing. She's incredible and I love her. But here's the question that I want us to think about. Since we're going to write another short essay over this weekend, you don't have to physically write out a paragraph for this, but this is just kind of something that to kind of mull over on the weekend, and we'll start on next Tuesday with a little discussion on this. Do you agree with this idea that it's almost harder for women in science today than it was back when Margaret Hamilton was young? And why or why not might that be the case? Are there any factors about our culture and society today, like maybe social media or things like that, that influence and make it harder for women in STEM fields now than maybe it was back in her day? So that's what I want you guys to think about. But that kind of concludes our PowerPoint on Margaret for today. Do we have any questions about her, the time period, anything that happened? If not, great. So then I will instead pull up our short essay 2 assignment sheet so we can talk about our essay options that we have for this long weekend that we're going to work on instead. So everyone did great on the short essays that they wrote last week. So this is going to be kind of the same style of thing. So all these instructions are the same. The due date is just different. It's July 21st now, which is next Tuesday. So just have this to me by next class period. But I'm going to show you who your options are. So once again, this is I've written this in like, if you like so-and-so, you could write about so-and-so, and then we have a completely different person at the bottom. But these are all very different and varied people. So first option is Hypatia, scholar of Alexandria. If you liked her, then you could write on Hildegard, scholar of Bingen, I think is how you pronounce that. She was from the Middle Ages, a medieval, she was like a religious figure. She's known also as Saint Hildegard, but she also studied philosophy, medicine, botany, a lot of different things. So she was kind of an all-around scholar in the Middle Ages. So you can write on her. I've included a link, obviously. If you found learning about Rosalind Franklin and DNA interesting, you can write on Kono Yasui, who is Japan's first botanist. She was the first woman in Japan to ever receive a PhD, and she got one in botany. So once again, here's a Smithsonian article about her and how she broke down some of Japan's gender barriers to get her PhD in science. And if you found Margaret Hamilton and software engineering to be super interesting, then you can also write on Ida Lovelace and scientific computing, who lived during like the Victorian period and kind of pioneered this field of scientific computing. So I've got an article there as well. And if you want someone completely different, you can write on Maria Mitchell, who was the first American woman astronomer, who is super interesting, and she has a comet named after her as well, which is kind of fun to think about. So this is going to be the same format as last week. You pick one of those people, write a short 2-3 page essay on her. I think I said 2 was the 2 double-spaced pages is our minimum, but it can be longer if you want it to be longer. If you find any pictures, you can include them in it too if you'd like. But yeah, basically pretty much the same thing. And then on Tuesday, we are going to start on our Legends week. So we're going to be talking about, as far as I can tell, Pocahontas, Mulan, and Anastasia next week. We'll open class wrapping up that Margaret Hamilton question, talk a little bit about your essays, and then continue on with our person for the week. Any questions, comments, concerns about anything? Fantastic. Okay, so I will see you guys all